Szayelaporro Granz was not a character that anybody was seriously power scaling against the upper levels of the ESPADA. He held the 8th ranking position and was the self-proclaimed perfect being. During the Hueco arc, he got completely humiliated by Mayuri in one of the most one-sided battles in the series. He was then forced to endure centuries of mentally perceived agony as Mayuri's superhuman drug slowed his final movements into an eternity of suffering before a Zanpakuto pierced his heart. Szayelaporro was this performative genius who was reduced to begging for his death. Since then, Szayelaporro has emerged from hell itself to do something that no version of this character should have any business doing. He threatened a post-Royal Guard training Renji Abarai. He held his own against Ichigo Kurosaki, and he did all of this without showing any signs of faltering. Nobody would have believed you before the release of the No Breeds of Hell one-shot chapter that Szayelaporro would one day have a legitimate argument for surpassing Ulquiorra, the fan-favorite 4th ranking ESPADA who has the legendary Segunda Etapa. All of the evidence that we've received from the one-shot Hell chapter paints a very compelling picture. So in this video, we're going to look at exactly why Hell Arc Szayelaporro has a case for being stronger than Ulquiorra. Heck, he may be the strongest ESPADA in the entire series. Before getting into the details of the Hell one-shot chapter, there's a foundational piece of Szayelaporro's history that a lot of people either don't know about or straight up overlook. According to the Spirits Are Forever With You light novels, which included all new character and lore details that were provided directly by Kubo himself, it was revealed that Szayelaporro Granz was once the 0 ranking ESPADA. He was at the very top of the food chain. When he first became a Hollow, he consumed his own brother, the one who would later become Ylfert Granz, and the combined entity achieved staggering levels of power, enough to earn that 0 designation under the original ESPADA system. But Szayelaporro's obsession with research and perfection drove him to split himself from Ylfert. He found that his brother's fighting spirit was interfering with his ability to conduct experiments, and so he severed that part of himself. There was a huge cost to doing this, as he lost the vast majority of his power and was demoted all the way down to the Privaron ESPADA, as he was essentially a disgraced former member of the upper ranks. He would eventually claw his way back to relevance as the 8th ranking ESPADA, but only by leaning on his intellect rather than raw strength. This is the Szayelaporro that we knew during the Arrancar arc. He was a genius compensating for a body that couldn't keep up with the monsters above him. Kubo confirmed all of this through his work with Ryogo Narita during the postscript for Spirits Are Forever With You, where he stated that he was surprised at how well Narita understood the Bleach world. So this isn't some random novel filler. This is legitimate backstory for Szayelaporro, and it completely reframes how we view the character and what happened to him in the Hell chapter. If Szayelaporro was operating at a fraction of his original potential for the entirety of the Arrancar arc, and Hell maybe has a way of restoring or even amplifying the power of those cast into it, then the Szayelaporro who emerged from those gates is a fundamentally different entity from the one that Mayuri killed. Before we directly compare Szayelaporro to Ulquiorra, a lot of people treat the ESPADA rankings as gospel truth. Ulquiorra is the 4th ranking, Szayelaporro is the 8th, and therefore Ulquiorra is categorically stronger. That's where the discussion ends for them, but if you actually look at how the ranking system functions throughout Bleach, it was never that simple, and Kubo went out of his way to prove it. Yami is the 10th ranking ESPADA, and then he transforms and becomes the 0 rank. His tattoo literally changes on his body. So were the rankings measuring base form only? If so, then Ulquiorra's Segunda Etapa exists completely outside of that system. His number 4 tattoo vanishes entirely when he transforms. He's literally removed from Aizen's hierarchy. Aizen also used the rankings as tools of psychological manipulation. Baragon was the self-proclaimed king of Hueco, and Aizen stuck him at number 2 just to remind him of who was really in charge. Luffy was slotted into the 6th slot as a temporary replacement for Grimmjow, and when Grimmjow killed him to reclaim his position, the system just shuffled to accommodate it. Then we have Neutra, who climbed from the 8th rank to the 5th through brute force. So yeah, the entire ESPADA ranks have always been fluid, politically charged, and designed to keep the ESPADA competing against one another rather than uniting against Aizen. The Bleach Bleach databooks state that the rankings are based on combat ability and Reiatsu, and for the most part they function as a rough hierarchy, but rough is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, because when you have characters with hidden transformations, characters whose abilities hard counter specific matchups, and a ranking system overseen by the greatest manipulator in the series, treating these numbers as absolute truth is exactly what Aizen wanted everyone to do. Even the ESPADA themselves bought into it, and that was the point. So no, Szayelaporro being ranked 8th doesn't automatically disqualify him from this conversation, especially not after what happened in the Hell one-shot. We learn a lot about Szayelaporro's newfound strength during his confrontation with Renji in the one-shot. To understand why this matters as much as it does, you have to understand just how strong Renji is by this point in the story, because this is something that I think a lot of people overlook. This is Renji, who went to the royal palace, trained with Ichigo himself, learned the true name of his Bankai So'o Zabimaru, and came back down to the Serete as a completely different Shinigami. He tanked Mask the Masculine's Star Murder Punch with his bare hand. Mask had just annihilated 2 captains, Rose and Kensei, back to back. Vizard captains who each have Bankai who could not stop this Sternritter, but Renji showed up and incinerated him with Zaga Teppo, and Mask scales above the vast majority of the ESPADA by default. The Sternritter as a collective were a step above the Arrancar thread. Even mid-tier Sternritter were giving captains problems that the ESPADA couldn't. So when you consider that Renji, after his Royal Guard training, was casually taking out a Sternritter who had defeated 2 captain level Vizards, you're looking at a character who is comfortably in the upper levels of Bleach Shinigami. And then in the anime, Renji goes on to fight Uryu Ishida in an anime exclusive scene. This is where he uses the full extent of his true Bankai, as he debuts even more abilities like Hihio Tensho and Zagai Zeko. So by the time of the Hell chapter, with a decade of additional growth on top of that Royal Guard training, Renji is comfortably one of the strongest characters in Bleach. And then Hell Arc Szayelaporro wrapped chains around this man and pierced through his body before Renji could even do anything about it. Renji could break the chains with his physical strength, but he couldn't create enough distance with Shumpo because the chains were outspeeding him. Hell Arc Szayelaporro was posing a genuine threat to Renji, who would have absolutely demolished the Arrancar arc version of him, and it took Ichigo himself physically intervening and severing the chains with his Zanpakuto in order to free Renji. After that, Szayelaporro pivoted straight to engaging Ichigo and held his own without any sign of faltering. There are some massive implications here. Post-Royal Guard Renji is operating at a level that makes the gap between old ESPADA rankings completely meaningless, and Szayelaporro was giving him real problems. There were none of the issues of the Hueco Mundo arc, where Renji faced off against Szayelaporro in a controlled lab with his Bankai sealed and pre-planted data. So what exactly did Szayelaporro gain from his time in Hell? Well, the first thing that you notice is that his entire physical appearance is altered. His hollow yoke has been shed, so his hollow hole is no longer bound to his flesh. Instead, his hate and suffering now pour from his brain like tears, and this manifests as 2 curving ram-like horns that sprout from his temples, drawing blood as they emerge. It mirrors a lot of the physical transformations that we've seen from characters who have truly transcended what they once were. Think of Segunda Itapa or Aizen's Hokyoku evolved forms. Szayelaporro now carries the unique title Jailer of Hell. He's been given authority within this realm, it seems, and he appears to have a lot of new abilities accompanying this authority. Firstly, there's the Chain Manifestation, which is the most visually dramatic. Szayelaporro can summon black crimson chains from the ground that are strong enough to bind and puncture opponents. These chains caught Renji off guard, pierced through multiple areas of his body at the same time, and they held him in place with durability that Renji's considerable physical strength was unable to overcome. It needs to be emphasized here that these are not gimmick abilities. These are restraints that can pin down fighters that are operating at levels far beyond anything that we've seen within the Arrancar arc. Then there's the clairvoyance. Szayelaporro states that Jailers of Hell are clairvoyant, and he demonstrates this by immediately identifying Ichika Itapa as Renji's daughter despite never having seen her before. Now, you could argue that a pink-haired girl clinging to Renji's leg isn't exactly a mystery, but Szayelaporro's knowledge extends far beyond identifying family relations. He knows the full details of the Konso Reisei ceremony. He understands that the ritual performed for deceased captains is actually sending their souls to hell. He's aware that the gates of hell were being held shut by the combined Reiatsu of Aizen and Yhwach. He knows that those powers have now subsided. He even recognizes Ukitake by name and the title that Ukitake received upon entering hell. And this is despite him having never met the captain. Whether if this is true supernatural clairvoyance or information gathered through hell's own network, it does represent a kind of omniscient awareness that makes him far more dangerous than the guy who had to plant spirit recording insects on his brother just to learn about Renji's Bankai. And then beyond all of this, we have his spiritual power, which has increased significantly. Szayelaporro went from being a mid-tier espada who relied on tricks, preparation, and his controlled lab environment to a direct combatant who can threaten the strongest lieutenants and even hold his own against Ichigo in a straight-up confrontation. This is a staggering jump in raw capability. This brings us with a comparison to Ulquiorra, the 4th-ranking espada, the wielder of the legendary Segunda Itapa, the form that Aizen supposedly hadn't even seen. I know a lot of people are going to push back on the idea that Szayelaporro could surpass this, and I understand why, but I think that the scaling here is actually fairly clean once you lay it all out. The peak feats of Ulquiorra come from his battle against Ichigo on the Dome of Las Noches. In his initial release, Murcielago, Ulquiorra completely overwhelmed Bankai holified Ichigo. Ichigo couldn't even land a scratch, let alone compete with Ulquiorra, and this is undeniably impressive. And then he activates Segunda Itapa and the gap widened even further, culminating in him killing Ichigo outright with a Cerro Oscuras through the chest. His Lanza del Relampago was powerful enough to carve craters into Las Noches. His speed was unmatched, along with his regeneration that was also active. By every measure, Segunda Itapa Ulquiorra was an absolute monster. But here's the thing, that version of Ichigo which Ulquiorra fought was running on a fraction of his true potential. This was pre-Dangai training Ichigo, pre-Fullbring, pre-awakening of his true Zanpakuto when it was reforged in the Royal Palace. The Ichigo who fought Ulquiorra would go on to face Aizen and need an entirely separate transformation just to be in the conversation. The distance between that version of Ichigo and the one who shows up in the Hell chapter is astronomical. Hell chapter Ichigo has gone through everything. He's achieved Mugetsu, done Dangai, awakened his true Zanpakuto, and he's had 10 plus years to master all of the abilities and transformations that come with the awakening of his true Zanpakuto. And shockingly, Hell Arc Szayelaporro engaged this version of Ichigo and he held his own. We literally see Ichigo sweating, using both arms to block Szayelaporro's strikes. Now, even if Ichigo wasn't in Bankai, even if he wasn't going all out, the fact that Szayelaporro could engage him at all without being instantly obliterated is a feat that completely dwarfs anything Ulquiorra demonstrated. Because the gap between the Ichigo that Ulquiorra fought and the Ichigo that Szayelaporro in the Hell Arc fought is not a small step. This is multiple entire arcs worth of exponential growth. We're talking about arguably the most dramatic power escalation in all of Bleach, which separates these two versions of our main character. If you recall what we discussed earlier about Renji, the same logic applies from his side of the scaling. A character who demolished a Sternritter that soloed 2 Vizard captains was being genuinely pressured by Szayelaporro. Szayelaporro didn't have any of the advantages that he had in the Hueco Mundo arc. Here, he was out in the open with nothing but raw power and these new Hell abilities. So yeah, this alone places Hell Arc Szayelaporro in a tier that the old Espada hierarchy cannot account for. A lot of people in the community pushed back on the idea that Szayelaporro could have surpassed the rest of the Espada, and the argument was always that if Hell empowers its inhabitants, then Stark, Barragan, Ulquiorra, and the rest would have gotten the same power boost. So naturally, they would still be above him since they were stronger than him in life. But that assumes Hell distributes power equally, which we have have zero evidence for. What we do have evidence for is that Szayelaporro holds a specific title and role within Hell. He's the jailer, he has clairvoyance, he has chain manifestation abilities that appear to be specific to his station. So it cannot be assumed that everyone sent to Hell gets these power buffs. And you have to also recall Szayelaporro was once the 0 ranking ESPADA, prior to him sacrificing his power for the pursuit of knowledge. Spirits Are Forever With You establishes that his original power was extraordinary. Shien Granz, the clone based on that pre-split Szayelaporro, was a monster in his own right, so the potential was always there, buried under layers of self-inflicted limitation. Hell may have simply unlocked what was always sleeping inside of him, or it's given him back that which he had thrown away and then added Hell's own amplification on top of it, which is just going to be insane to imagine. There's a problem with measuring Ulquiorra's segunda etapa. The form is undeniably powerful, but the context of its use makes pinning down exactly how powerful it is impossible. Ulquiorra was already dominating Ichigo comfortably in his first release. Murcielago was so far above Bankai holified Ichigo that the fight was essentially over before segunda etapa was activated. Ulquiorra used it to crush Ichigo's hope. It wasn't used because he actually needed it. So we didn't really ever get a clear benchmark for how much stronger segunda etapa actually is compared to his initial release. We know that it's stronger and faster, and we are aware that Lanza del Relámpago is devastating, but we don't have a ceiling because nobody in that fight pushed him to his limits. The only character who challenged segunda etapa Ulquiorra was Ichigo's Vasto Lore form, and that version of Ichigo was essentially an uncontrolled berserker that was running on pure instinct, which overwhelmed Ulquiorra almost instantly. So segunda etapa exists in this strange scenario where it's clearly devastating, but its actual limits are not known. Meanwhile, Szayelaporro's Hell Arc feats are clean and measurable to an extent. We know exactly how strong post-Royal Guard Renji is. We know what that version of Ichigo he confronted had been through. And to be honest, we're being very generous because we're not even taking into account the time gap between the 1000-year Blood War arc and the Hell Arc one-shot, as there's 12 years of additional training and strengthening that you have to account for, which Szayelaporro appears to scale to. I do think people will bring up Uryu's description of Ulquiorra's segunda etapa spiritual pressure. In chapter 348, he describes the energy that he is feeling as something totally alien. He says that it is not just powerful or massive, but that it is so thick and heavy that it barely qualifies as spiritual pressure anymore. He compares it to an ocean above the sky, and that description is significant because Uryu is a Quincy. Sensing Reiatsu is what Quincy do. It's fundamental to their style of fighting. So when a Quincy tells you that what he is sensing feels like something from a different dimension of power, that carries a lot of weight. But again, there is something important that people overlook. Uryu at that point in the story had never felt the spiritual pressure of Baragon or Stark in their release states. He had never been exposed to anything at that level of power before. So his reaction to the overwhelming power of segunda etapa is absolutely valid. It does not automatically place Ulquiorra above every other character at that point in the story. It tells us that Ulquiorra's segunda etapa was incomprehensibly powerful relative to Uryu's frame of reference at that time. It's also worth mentioning that later in Bleach, other characters demonstrate spiritual pressure described in somewhat similar ways. Think to Shunsui's Bankai, the holy forms of Lil Barrow, or even Senjumaru's anime-exclusive Bankai activation, where all of the three realms had trembled upon its awakening. So while the ocean above the sky description is iconic and very poetic, it doesn't compare to having a Bankai activation that shakes the three realms. And that's exactly the level of power that we're dealing with during the 1000-year Blood War arc. Now what you have to also remember is Szayelaporro's chains are a binding technique. He restrained Renji and pierced him with chains that emerged from the ground. You could argue that catching someone off guard with an unknown restraint ability is not the same thing as overpowering them in direct combat. You could push back and argue that Renji was not completely blindsided. Once the chains were on him, he actively tried to break free using his physical strength and he couldn't do it. He attempted to create distance with Shumpo and the chains were outspeeding him. So the chains didn't just catch Renji by surprise, they actively outperformed his physical capabilities after he was aware of them and he was trying to counter them. So yes, I do think Szayelaporro posed a genuine threat to Renji despite his own significant increase in power. Again, Renji fans can argue that he may have been flustered as he was concerned about Ichika, so the entire confrontation may have been against a Renji who has lost his nerve or isn't fully composed. And the the last thing I want to acknowledge is the obvious limitation of this entire discussion. We only have a single chapter to go off of. The Hell Arc chapter gave us a glimpse of what Szayelaporro has become, but it's just a preview. We don't have extended fight sequences. We do not have detailed ability breakdowns the way that we did with Ulquiorra across multiple chapters on the Dome of Las Noches. I could be completely wrong about how this scales once more Hell Arc content is released. Kubo could reveal that Ichigo was holding back far more than we assume, especially considering that this encounter took place within the world of the living, where it is known that the Gente reign is active. So Renji and Ichigo's spiritual pressure may have been suppressed to 20% of his maximum capacity, so that their immense power doesn't damage or negatively affect the environment of the world of the living. Again, that's another aspect that people will overlook in this discussion. Despite this, I still think that the argument holds up, because even if you account for every possible caveat, the fundamental issue remains. The characters that Szayelaporro was contending with in the Hell chapter exist on a plane of power that the Arrancar arc does not reach. 20% of the max capacity of true Shikai Ichigo is still overwhelmingly more powerful than Ichigo from the Arrancar arc. And the same goes for Renji. And this is versions of both characters that have had 12 years since their feats in the 1000 Year Blood War arc to further refine their abilities. So yeah, overall, Hell did something to Szayelaporro Grants that I don't think anyone anticipated. It took one of the weaker members of the ESPADA, a character who was defined by his mind rather than his strength, and it transformed him into a genuine threat against the strongest characters in the series. And yeah, in the end, I think Hell Arc Szayelaporro completely outpaces Segunda Etapa Ulquiorra from the Arrancar arc. Before Ulquiorra fans get mad and talk about Ulquiorra returning in the Hell Arc and him being exponentially more stronger, well, we haven't seen that happen yet, and I can only go off of what's been released thus far. We have reached the point of the video where I do want to hand over the discussion to all of you. Do you agree with my assessment within this video? Is Hell Arc Szayelaporro really as strong as what he was made out to be in the Hell Arc one-shot, or is there something that I've forgotten to mention which may have given him an edge over Ichigo and Renji? And I'd love to know your comparison between Hell Arc Szayelaporro and Ulquiorra's Segunda Etapa. Do continue the discussion in the comments, and lastly, thanks for making it to the end of this one, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.
A massive thank you goes out to all of my amazing Patreon supporters for helping to make this video possible. If you also want to support the channel and see your name in the end of my videos, then check out my Patreon, which has loads of perks like early video access and so much more. Thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.